All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into a really fascinating set of sources. It's basically the notes and discussions from a reading group that's been really wrestling with some big questions, cybernetics, biology, cognition. They were reading papers by people like Matana, Wiener, Levin, Rosen, even Norbert Wiener's book, Human Use of Human Beings, which feels incredibly relevant now.
Absolutely. And these aren't just, dusty old papers. They're hitting on things we're all talking about today. What does it mean for something to be alive? What is intelligence, really? Can machines actually think or be agents? And, maybe most importantly, how does our own viewpoint, our perspective, shape how we even answer those questions?
Exactly. So our mission here is to unpack all that. We want to pull out the core ideas, the real sticking points, maybe some surprising connections the group found, basically give you a shortcut into some deep thinking, historical and current in this whole space. Okay, let's get into it. Maybe the best place to start is with something really fundamental that kept coming up, the idea of description. Matana, one of the authors they discussed, had this really powerful take. When you describe something, you're not just talking about the thing, you're actually inherently saying something about yourself, the observer.
That's right. And he was quite specific. He wasn't focused on, say, what an organism is thinking internally or its mental representation. No, he focused on its behavior, its interactions, what you can actually see it doing. And the really key part is the meaning of that behavior, its significance, especially in relation to its environment, its niche. Well, that meaning isn't in the organism. It exists exclusively in the cognitive domain of the observer. You was watching.
Wow. So, okay, what that means then is how we talk about any system, whether it's a tiny cell or a complex AI or even another person. It reveals just as much about our own tools, our own assumptions, our own, maybe, biases, as it does about the system itself. This thread came up when the group was talking about communicating descriptions, right? And how organisms operate within their domains of interaction.
Exactly. That's the set of things they can actually perceive and respond to. And it gets even more interesting. An organism with a nervous system, especially a complex one, can do something else. It can interact recursively with its own state. It's like it can think about its own thinking or process its own processes. And this ability allows it to expand its domain. How? By interacting with descriptions of its own interactions. Think about language. The sources see language as this kind of orienting behavior, but it fundamentally needs at least two interacting beings. It's cooperative. It creates a shared linguistic domain.
This whole idea, description being relative to the observer, knowledge being limited by our ability to describe it, really does echo those old philosophical questions, doesn't it? Like, what's really out there, beyond what our senses or language can grasp? What's outside the cave? Things we maybe can't know by definition because knowledge is always filtered through us.
Precisely. And it connects directly to this idea that analysis itself is, well, fundamentally relative. When you break something down into parts, you analyze it. The knowledge you get is relative to that specific way of breaking it down. It's not some kind of absolute truth. Absolute knowledge, if it exists, is described more metaphorically, like knowing something intuitively, or maybe even participating in the thing. We have this sort of intuitive, non-analytical grasp of our own personality, perhaps, that kind of thing.
Okay, so using that lens observer relative description, it immediately makes things tricky when we get to another major theme for the group. The difference, or maybe the lack of difference, between machines and living systems, especially now, right? Our machines are getting so complex, the lines feel blurry. The sources looked back at the classic 20th century view of machines and then asked, well, what happens when you add machine learning? Big data, complex interaction with the environment. Does that make a machine more alive? Or is it just a fancier version of the same old concept?
It's a really crucial question, and they used a great analogy, I thought, the toaster. But forget just a smart toaster with a screen and maybe ChatGPT built in. That's just surface complexity. Imagine a toaster that can sense the minerals in your water and adjust itself. Or even better, one that can repair itself if something goes slightly wrong. That kind of system starts to look intelligent, resilient, in a way that really pushes against our standard definition of machine.
Right. And a key idea connecting these advanced systems to life, which the group picked up on, is self-organization. Systems that can actually change their own internal structure, adapt on the fly based on conditions.
Exactly. But there's a flip side, too. These complex machines can show what they call perverse instantiation. Basically, unexpected behaviors, things you definitely didn't program in directly, like, an AI hallucinating, or AlphaGo using totally alien strategies in Go.
Yeah.
It's not just a bug. It suggests that even if you build it bottom up, you don't always get predictable top-down control. which actually happens in biology too, right? Maladaptive traits, evolutionary leftovers,
Oh, yeah.
legacy parts that aren't optimal but just hang around.
So this leads to a really provocative suggestion from the sources. Maybe thinking in terms of machine or not machine is becoming outdated. Maybe a more useful way to look at complex systems in the future is by measuring the amount of self-controlled allostasis they exhibit.
Okay, allostasis. Let's unpack that quickly because it's different from homeostasis, which most people know.
Right, homeostasis is like your thermostat maintaining a steady, fixed state, like body temperature.
Exactly. Allostasis, though, is different. It's the ability to actively seek out and transition between different stable states as needed, to meet goals, to survive changing conditions. It implies detection, prediction, and crucially, autonomous decision-making about which state is appropriate now. This capacity for self-controlled state shifting, based on internal needs and external factors, is proposed as a key feature. Maybe it applies to both life and advanced future machines.
And this connects to the idea of a living machine, or even hybrids. They floated the idea of coupling a conscious living system, like a brain, with machine, as a way to explore machine intelligence, maybe. But it subtly begs the question, doesn't it? Can a machine all by itself ever be conscious, have genuine intelligent experience?
And that classic thought experiment came up, the neuron replacement. Imagine you take a healthy conscious brain and replace one neuron at a time with a functionally identical electronic component, one by one. Is there a point where consciousness just flickers out? Is it 50%, 99%? Never. It really highlights that gut feeling, that sort of vitalist intuition many people have, that there might be something fundamentally different at life, something non-mechanical.
So, okay, if the boundaries are blurring in terms of complexity, self-organization, maybe even allostasis, what about agency? Can both machines and living things be agents? The sources definitely got into this. Physicality might not be the dividing line for machines anymore, but agency, that feels different.
Yeah, the idea discussed is that living organisms seem to have this natural agency, an inherent ability to set their own goals, internal goals, and then pursue them. And doing that effectively requires anticipating consequences, right? Planning ahead, even in simple ways.
And this is where one source makes a really strong claim, maybe even a controversial one. It basically says that this natural agency, along with cognition and consciousness, is fundamentally vertical, non-computational.
Right, okay, that's a dense phrase, vertical, non-computational. Let's try to unpack it. The argument centers on a process they call relevance realization. Basically, how does any system, living or potentially artificial, figure out what's relevant in any given situation? Think about it, the number of potential factors, features, possible actions is practically infinite. How do you constantly dynamically zero in on what matters for your current goals? The claim is that this process, this relevance realization, is not algorithmic. It's too open-ended, too context-dependent, too fluid to be captured by any fixed set of rules, any finite computation.
So it's not just saying, oh, it's too complex to model right now.
No, exactly. It's a deeper claim. It's saying it's impossible in principle to fully capture this core aspect of agency and cognition with a purely formal computational model. Any such model will, by its nature, be incomplete. It can't fully grasp the richness of relevance realization.
Okay. And this helps explain why some of these views might seem antagonistic, as the note said, to the idea that the boundaries are just smoothly blurring.
Precisely. It links to an extension of Rosen's conjecture. Robert Rosen was a theoretical biologist who argued complex living systems aren't fully formalizable. The extension is basically, if an organism isn't even formalizable, then asking if it's computable doesn't even make sense anymore. You can't compute something you can't fully describe in a formal language to begin with.
Interesting. So did they look at other ways of thinking about this, like the free energy principle? I know that's a big framework for adaptation.
They did mention FEP. It describes systems trying to minimize surprise or free energy, essentially seeking predictable states, paths of least resistance. It's very powerful for modeling adaptation. But the source arguing for the non-computational view positioned FEP as still being, quote, embedded in an algorithmic or small world framework.
Small world framework. What does that mean here?
In this context, it means that any system defined purely by an algorithm, or even FEP as currently formulated, can only ever explore a finite predefined set of possible states or behaviors. It's a small world compared to the potentially infinite richness of reality. The argument is that life, through relevance realization, isn't confined to such a small world. It's fundamentally open-ended in a way algorithms aren't.
This also ties into something else mentioned, the idea that organisms don't need perfect, complete models of the world. They just need models that are good enough to survive, right?
Exactly. Like science itself, maybe. We use Occam's razor. We build compact, useful, predictive models, heuristics, almost. They're good enough for navigating the world, but we don't pretend they capture the absolute, total reality of things. Organisms might operate similarly.
And then there's the whole emergence debate that popped up. How complex stuff arises from simpler parts.
Yeah, the group seemed to question whether emergence is always something truly non-computational, something fundamentally unpredictable. Or if sometimes we just use the word emergence like, well, like magic, a placeholder for complex interactions we don't fully understand or can't easily predict yet. It highlights that tension between philosophical takes and computational ones.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. The sources also brought up some really surprising biological findings, especially around memory, that challenge older ideas. Norbert Wiener, for example, back in the day, suggested that something really radical like metamorphosis, a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, would surely erase memories, because the physical structure, the continuity of organization is just too disrupted.
Right, that was the thinking. But modern research actually shows that's not necessarily true. Memory can survive pretty dramatic changes. They mentioned hibernating squirrels. Their brains undergo significant cell loss and rewiring during hibernation, but they wake up and remember where they stored their nuts.
Wow.
And there are actual studies on insects showing learned associations persisting through metamorphosis. So that idea of needing strict, unbroken physical continuity seems uh, complicated now.
And there are other biological examples too, right? Planarians.
Yeah, the flatworms, classic experiments where they train them, then cut them in half, and both regenerated halves seem to retain some of the training. It's wild stuff. And also, studies on the little worm C. elegans. They found that stress experienced by one generation, like being starved into a dormant state called L1 arrest, can have effects on the behavior of its descendants for several generations.
Transgenerational epigenetic inheritance.
Exactly. Information being passed down not through changes in the DNA sequence itself, but through how genes are marked or expressed. We even see hints of this in human populations after historical famines.
So what does this say about memory? It seems less about a single fixed location and more distributed, or maybe about storage versus access.
That's a really interesting point that came up. How can memories be maintained, stored somewhere in the system, even if they aren't consciously accessible or easily retrieved right now? Think about procedural memory, like riding a bike. It's stored, probably involves the cerebellum, and you retrieve it to perform the action, but you might not consciously remember the moment you learned each specific muscle movement. The information is stored, but access is different.
They also touched on genetic information, the idea that DNA isn't just a simple blueprint for anatomical shape. You can't easily read the shape off the sequence.
Right, it's not a direct map in that sense. But, they pointed out, it is very much a program for protein sequences. That part is quite deterministic. So while predicting the whole organism's final form, the phenotype, from genes alone is incredibly complex, maybe impossible in full detail, predicting protein function from sequence is often quite feasible.
And genetic engineering was brought up as a kind of test case.
Yeah, like when scientists engineer bacteria by adding specific genes to make them produce insulin or some other useful chemical. Is that an example of biological programming? Does it show that biological systems are amenable to formal manipulation in some ways? Maybe challenging those claims about them being fundamentally non-formalizable? Or is it a special case? It's a good question to chew on.
Okay, moving towards communication, especially human language. Wiener had this interesting observation. He said, basically all communication systems end up terminating in some kind of machine, but human language terminates in a very special kind of machine, a human being.
Uh-huh. And building on that, one idea was that language isn't just the physical ability to make sounds or string words together. It's something deeper, a power of speech linked to an innate drive to symbolize, to encode and decode meaning. So the reason chimps don't talk like us might not just be their vocal cords. Maybe they lack that fundamental cognitive machinery, that drive to represent the world symbolically and share it in that way.
There was also this fascinating idea about receiving information, but not having the key to unlock it yet. Like hearing a song or seeing a piece of art that doesn't fully click at the time. The information is in you, passively stored, but its meaning or function only becomes clear later, maybe when you learn something else or have a new experience that provides the context.
Yeah, that resonates. It suggests information can be sort of latent in a system, stored, but not yet activated or fully integrated until the right conditions arise, the right connections are made.
And this led into thinking about information itself as distinct from physical stuff.
Right. The difficulty of treating information like a simple commodity compared to, say, iron ore or grain. and how our legal systems, like patent law, have struggled to keep up with how invention actually happens, now shifting from maybe a lone inventor in a workshop to huge corporate R&D labs where information and knowledge are the core assets, driven by profit.
Which brings us squarely into the social and ethical side, pulling heavily from Wiener's human use of human beings.
Hmm.
His big concern, even back then, wasn't really about Skynet machines taking over on their own. It was much more about how people would use increasingly powerful machines to control, manipulate, or, justify actions against other people.
And wow, does that feel relevant today or what? Think about just navigating the current information environment, the sheer overload, the difficulty in finding the actual signal amidst all the noise. That feeling many people have that social forces, often amplified by technology, are pulling us away from things that genuinely matter. Or how communication is incentivized just for its own sake, even if there's no real need. Or how art and science get treated just like products to be churned out, measured by quantity, losing that deeper sense of purpose.
It also connects to that recurring anxiety, that sort of doom narrative you see throughout history. The feeling that things are changing too fast technologically, socially, for our institutions, or even our individual minds. To really cope, it's not a new feeling, but maybe the scale feels different now.
Definitely. And they used a great modern analogy for these themes, the cyberpunk idea of a brain dance, these fictional recordings of someone's entire sensory and emotional experience that you can stream directly into your own brain.
Right, total immersion.
Yeah. It vividly captures those questions about authenticity, control, escapism, mass entertainment, and the very nature of experience that Wiener was already grappling with decades ago, just with the technology available then.
So we've really covered a lot of ground here. From the fundamental act of description shaping reality to the blurring lines between life and machines, the deep questions around agency, whether it's computational or not, these surprising biological insights into memory and information, and finally, how these seemingly abstract ideas echo in very real social and ethical concerns today.
It really shows the value of going back to these foundational texts and the kind of deep thinking they represent, the questions they raise, the frameworks they built. They're not just historical curiosities. They give us tools and perspectives that are incredibly useful for navigating the complexities we face now as we build new kinds of machines and try to figure out what it all means.
Absolutely. And maybe a final thought to leave you, the listener, with something that sort of emerges from all this. If our understanding of everything, cognition, computation, agency, maybe even the self, is fundamentally tied to the observer, to our descriptive limits, our interactions, and if machines are getting better at things like self-controlled allostasis, showing unexpected behaviors, becoming more autonomous, what new kinds of agency or intelligence, or maybe even forms of consciousness might arise that we literally don't have the concepts or the language for right now? What happens when the main observer interacting with a complex system is another complex machine? Something to think about. We hope this deep dive gave you plenty to consider. Until next time, keep exploring.